I thought the thing chained in the basement of the lycanthrope tower was just a monster, a rabid, uncontrollable nightmare that Alpha King Alexander Sterling kept hidden in the dark. In my past life, that was what they told me. In my past life, I was terrified of it, terrified of him, and I died screaming in one of these very cells while the highborns drank champagne 3 floors above. But that was before. When I opened my eyes and found myself gasping on the cold concrete floor, my lungs burning, the phantom pain of my brutal execution still fresh on my skin, I thought I was in hell. Then the smell hit me, damp stone copper, and the undeniable, heavy musk of an alpha predator. I wasn't in hell, I was back. Exactly 5 years back, on the night of the Blood Moon Gala. The night I was supposed to stumble down here by accident panic, and seal my fate as a terrified, submissive Omega meant to be broken. The faint, rhythmic thumping of bass from the jazz band upstairs seeped through the ceiling. It was surreal up there. The elite of New York's Lycan society were clinking crystal glasses and making deals that moved millions. Down here, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of violence. Then I heard it, the heavy, metallic scrape of chains dragging across the floor, followed by a low, guttural growl that vibrated straight through the soles of my shoes and into my chest. I pushed myself up, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer, overwhelming rush of adrenaline and something darker, fury, cold. Absolute fury. I looked down at my hands. They were smooth, unmarked. The scars they had carved into me weren't there yet. I was whole. I turned toward the deepest shadow in the basement. I couldn't see it clearly, just a massive silhouette, a hulking mass of midnight fur and muscle. But its eyes, 2 burning spheres of molten gold, were fixed on me, the beast. Alexander's manifestation of rage, suppressed trauma, and lethal instinct. The creature that the entire eastern seaboard whispered about in terrified tones. In my first life I had run. I had scrambled backward crying, acting exactly like the weak, orphan Omega they expected me to be. This time, I stood up and dusted off my simple servant's uniform. I took a deep, steadying breath, pulling the damp, feral air into my lungs. I didn't smell like fear anymore. I smelled like something that had clawed its way out of a grave. I know you can smell it, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yet it echoed sharply in the cavernous space. The beast paused. Its growl hitched, turning into a confused, rumbling sound. It stepped into the dim light cast by a single, flickering bulb. It was massive, terrifying, its jaws dripping with saliva, its claws gouging deep trenches into the concrete. It was designed to kill. But as I looked into those golden eyes, I didn't see a mindless killer. I saw a prisoner, a creature suffocating under the weight of its own master's denial. It was alone, just like I had been. I took a step forward. The chains rattled ominously. They say you're a monster, I murmured, my voice dropping to soothing, hypnotic cadence. They say you only know how to tear things apart. But they don't know anything, do they? Another step. The beast bared its fangs, a terrifying display of lethal power, a warning. I didn't stop. I reached into the pocket of my uniform and pulled out a small, sharp utility knife I used for cutting zip ties upstairs. The metallic click of the blade locking into place seemed impossibly loud. The beast tensed, ready to strike, its massive body coiling like a spring. I didn't raise the knife toward it. Instead, I brought the blade to my own left wrist. Without hesitation, I pressed down and dragged the steel across my pale skin. The pain was sharp, grounding. Blood welled up instantly, a vibrant, shocking crimson. The metallic tang of copper mixed with the potent, sweet pheromones of an Omega in distress, but laced with an unmistakable, bitter undertone of pure defiance. The beast froze, its golden eyes locked onto the blood. I extended my bleeding arm toward it, palm up. An offering, a blood pact. You're hungry, I whispered, stepping right into the creature's strike zone. I could feel the heat radiating from its massive body. I could see the individual hairs of its coarse black fur. You're starving for something real, something that isn't afraid of the dark. The beast leaned forward, its breath hot and damp against my arm. It didn't bite. It didn't tear my throat out, slowly, tentatively. It extended a massive, rough tongue and licked the blood from my wrist. A jolt of electricity shot up my arm, a visceral, primal connection snapping into place. Its eyes fluttered shut for a brief second, a low whine escaping its throat. It wasn't a monster. It was a weapon, and now, it was my weapon. Heavy footsteps echoed from the metal staircase behind me. Several sets of boots. Secure the perimeter. If it's broken the chains again, use the tranquilizers. I won't have it ruin the gala. That voice, deep, authoritative, cold as liquid nitrogen. Alpha King Alexander Sterling. I didn't flinch. I kept my hand steady as the beast nuzzled my bloody wrist, its massive head resting heavy against my palm. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The heavy steel door at the base of the stairs groaned open. Alexander stepped into the dim light, flanked by 3 heavily armed lichen guards. He was imposing, immaculate in a bespoke tuxedo, his silver blonde hair slicked back. But it was his eyes, the exact same molten gold as the beast's, that caught the flickering light. He stopped dead in his tracks. The guards behind him raised their weapons, but hesitated, their expressions shifting from combat readiness to absolute shock. Alexander stared at the impossible scene before him. His untamable, lethal nightmare, the manifestation of his deepest curses, was docilely nuzzling a nameless Omega's bleeding arm. I slowly turned my head to look at him over my shoulder. I didn't lower my gaze. I didn't cower. The dim, harsh light of the basement caught the hard lines of my face. I let a slow, deliberate smirk touch the corner of my lips, a smile that belonged to a ghost who had come back to collect. "Good evening, Your Majesty," I said softly, the silence of the basement amplifying every syllable. "It seems your dog likes me." The penthouse of the lycanthrope tower was a gilded cage of glass and steel, suspended high above the smog and noise of Manhattan. In my past life, I had never seen this floor. I had died in the dark. Now, I lived in the light, surrounded by panoramic views of a city that looked like scattered diamonds. Alexander had moved me up here the morning after the Blood Moon Gala. My official title in the pack registry was exclusive handler, but the elite of New York's Lycan society whispered a different title behind their crystal champagne flutes, the Beast Keeper. They thought I was a tamer. They didn't understand that you cannot tame a manifestation of pure, suppressed trauma. You can only acknowledge it. The beast was my constant shadow. As I walked through the cavernous, sunlit halls, the heavy, rhythmic padding of its massive paws against the Italian marble followed me. It was a comforting sound. Whenever we crossed paths with Alexander, the Alpha King would stop, his molten gold eyes tracking our movements with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He was trying to figure out the puzzle of how a nameless, orphaned Omega had effortlessly claimed the darkest part of his soul. I let him watch. I was enjoying the game. But my sudden elevation did not go unnoticed. Enter Evelyn Blackwood. She was a pureblood Omega from one of the oldest families on the eastern seaboard. In my first life, she had been the one to casually suggest to the elders that I was defective and needed to be sent to the dungeons. She was the quintessential White Lotus, all doe eyes, delicate size, and the suffocatingly sweet scent of artificial gardenias. She had always assumed the position of Alexander's future Luna was her birthright. "Oh, you poor thing," Evelyn crooned one afternoon, cornering me in the penthouse conservatory. The clinking of her diamond bracelets sounded like ice cracking. She looked me up and down, her perfectly glossed lips curled in a smile that didn't reach her cold eyes. "It must be so terrifying for you, being forced to live with that monster. The king is so cruel to use a fragile little servant as a chew toy." From the shadows of the exotic ferns a low, guttural growl rumbled. The beast stepped forward, its hackles raised, baring teeth the size of daggers. Evelyn gasped, taking a stumbling step back, her pale hands flying to her throat. I didn't flinch. I reached out, my fingers sinking into the thick, dark fur of the creature's neck. The growl instantly subsided into a soft, rumbling purr that vibrated up my arm. "He's not a monster, Lady Blackwood," I said, my voice smooth, polite, and dripping with thinly veiled poison. "He just has an excellent sense of smell. He hates the stench of rot hidden under cheap perfume." Her face flushed a mottled red, the mask of innocence slipping for a fraction of a second before she spun on her designer heels and stormed away. The war had officially begun. The climax of her pathetic schemes culminated at the winter solstice charity auction, held in the tower's grand ballroom. It was a suffocating sea of designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, and the overwhelming clash of alpha and omega pheromones. I was required to be there, standing quietly in the alcove with the beast, a living, breathing exhibit of the king's tamed power. Evelyn saw her opportunity. Surrounded by reporters and high-ranking pack members, she glided toward my alcove, holding a delicate crystal flute of red wine. Her plan was painfully obvious: stage a collision, spill the wine, accuse me of attacking her, and force Alexander to execute the rabid dog and its incompetent handler in front of the press. As she deliberately tripped, tossing the crimson liquid toward my face, time seemed to slow down. In my past life, I would have cowered. I would have cried and begged for forgiveness. This time, I simply stepped aside. The wine splashed harmlessly against the reinforced glass wall behind me, but Evelyn, having lost her balance in her theatrical performance, went crashing to the floor. The crystal flute shattered, the sharp, violent crack echoing through the suddenly silent ballroom. That sound, the sudden violence directed at me, was the only trigger the beast needed. It didn't just roar, it erupted. The sound was a concussive wave of primal fury that shattered the remaining floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows of the alcove. The glittering shards rained down like deadly snow. The beast leaped over me, landing squarely in front of Evelyn's sprawling figure. It slammed its massive paws into the marble, cracking the stone, its jaws snapping inches from her face in a terrifying display of protective rage. Evelyn didn't just scream, she shrieked a high, pathetic sound of absolute terror, before her eyes rolled back and she fainted dead away in a puddle of spilled wine. Pandemonium broke out. Guards rushed forward, but no one dared approach. I stood perfectly still amidst the falling glass, the corners of my mouth twitching upward in a dark, satisfied smile. I had done nothing. Evelyn had destroyed herself, and the beast had merely defended its own. Later that night, the wind howled through the penthouse balcony, carrying the chill of the New York winter. I stood by the railing, looking down at the city lights. Heavy footsteps approached from behind. Before I could turn, a large, powerful hand grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around and pinning me hard against the cold metal railing. Alexander was breathing heavily, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his tie undone. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his chest, smell the sharp, intoxicating scent of pine and raw alpha dominance. His eyes weren't their usual icy blue, they were flashing, shifting rapidly into the molten gold of the beast. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his voice a dangerous, velvet growl that sent a shiver down my spine. "I saw what you did tonight, Julian," he murmured, his gaze dropping to my lips before snapping back up to my eyes. "You didn't just survive her trap. You orchestrated her destruction without lifting a finger." He leaned his body weight into me, trapping me completely. "So tell me, what do you want from it? Or rather, what do you want from me?" I had become the velvet scabbard for a very lethal blade. Within weeks of the Winter Solstice Gala, the power dynamics in the Lycanthrope Tower had completely inverted. I was no longer a servant, nor just a handler. I was an untouchable ghost haunting the upper echelons of the Sterling Pack. The board members, the ancient alpha traditionalists who had orchestrated my brutal execution in my past life, now lowered their eyes when I walked past. They had to, because wherever I went, the heavy, rhythmic thump of the beast's massive paws followed. I was playing a dangerous, intoxicating game. I used the beast as a silent executioner, strategically placing myself in the path of my former enemies, letting the creature's aggressive posturing force them into humiliating submissions or forced resignations. But my most complex game was the one I played with the king himself. I weaponized my affection. I would spend hours in the sunlit conservatory, burying my face in the beast's dark fur, whispering sweet, soothing praises that made it purr like a giant feline. And I would do it exactly when I knew Alexander was watching from the doorway. I could hear the sharp, constrained intake of his breath. I could hear the slow, agonizing creak of his leather gloves stretching as his fists clenched. I gave his fractured soul the warmth it was starving for, but I withheld it entirely from the man himself. When Alexander spoke to me, my responses were perfectly polite, impeccably formal, and utterly devoid of warmth. I was pushing him, starving his human half while feeding his monster, driving the Alpha King to the absolute brink of a jealous, obsessive madness. I wanted to see him break. Until the night the game shattered. It happened in the tower's subterranean archives, a soundproof labyrinth of concrete and steel where I was searching for old pack registry files. The air down here was stale, humming with the low vibration of the ventilation system. The beast was pacing restlessly a few aisles over, distracted by the scent of old parchment. The first warning wasn't a sound, it was the abrupt absence of it. The hum of the vents cut out. Then the sharp, unmistakable clack of a tactical boot hitting the concrete. Before I could turn, the shadows detached themselves from the walls. 4 figures, masked and heavily armed, smelling of wolfsbane and desperate malice. Remnants of the old opposition, trying to cut off the king's rabid dog by severing its leash. One of them lunged, a silver blade catching the dim emergency lights. I didn't even have time to brace myself. The air pressure in the room violently dropped, followed immediately by a sound that would haunt my nightmares. It wasn't a roar. It was a demonic shriek of pure, unadulterated violence. The beast slammed into the first assassin with the force of a freight train. The impact was sickening, the wet, heavy crunch of bone snapping, the violent tearing of thick tactical fabric, and a wet gurgle that ended as abruptly as it began. "Kill the Omega," another yelled, raising a suppressed firearm. The beast didn't care about guns. It moved as a blur of midnight fury. I was shoved hard against the cold concrete wall, slipping on the suddenly slick floor. The smell hit me then copper, hot and thick, suffocating the stale air. Tear, snap, scream. The sounds were deafening. In the dim, flickering light, I saw the beast rip a man's arm from its socket before crushing his chest cavity with a single paw. It was a massacre. It was slaughter. And suddenly, I wasn't in the archives anymore. My breathing grew shallow, my vision blurring at the edges. I was back in the dungeons. I was smelling the same hot copper. I was hearing the same sound of my own ribs cracking, feeling the phantom agony of my past life's execution tearing through my nerves. The blood pooling at my feet wasn't theirs, in my mind. It was mine. I slid down the concrete wall, my hands trembling violently, my breath hitching in a pathetic, terrified whimper. The cold, absolute fury that had fueled me for weeks vanished, leaving behind only the broken, terrified Omega who had died screaming in the dark. Silence fell over the room, heavy and absolute, save for the wet drip of blood. The beast was gone. In its place, staggering through the carnage, was Alexander. He was half-shifted, his tuxedo shirt shredded, his hands stained crimson, his claws slowly retracting into trembling fingers. His eyes were blazing gold, wild and feral. He saw me huddled on the floor shivering, my eyes wide with a terror that wasn't meant for him, but for the ghosts of my past. "Julian," his voice was a jagged sound, torn from a bleeding throat. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, dropping to his knees in the blood. He didn't care about the bodies. He didn't care about the threat. His large, trembling hands reached out, desperately pulling me into his chest. "I've got you," he choked out, his voice cracking with a panic so profound it shocked me back to reality. "I've got you. You're safe. I won't let them touch you. I swear to God, I will burn this city to the ground before I let them touch you." He crushed me against him, hiding my face in the crook of his neck, shielding me from the sight of the gore. His body was shaking not with rage, but with absolute, paralyzing fear. Pressed tightly against his chest, my ear rested over his heart. Thump thump, thump thump. It was beating so frantically, so erratically, it felt like it was tearing itself apart trying to keep me tethered to the living world. I slowly raised my blood-stained hands and gripped the torn fabric of his shirt. I closed my eyes, breathing in the intoxicating scent of pine blood and his agonizing vulnerability. The man holding me wasn't a cold, calculating tyrant. He was terrified. He was broken. For the first time since I had returned from the dead, a cold spike of doubt pierced my perfect hatred. As I listened to his frantic heartbeat, a terrifying question echoed in my mind: if he is capable of this kind of desperate love, then who the hell gave the order to kill me in my past life? The sanctuary wasn't a church or a temple. It was an ancient, sprawling expanse of old-growth forest hidden deep in the Adirondack Mountains, heavily warded and strictly controlled by the Supreme Pack. To the outside world, it was a nature preserve. To Lycan society, it was the sacred ground where alpha kings were crowned, and where corrupted souls were cleansed. Or in my case, where they were meant to be executed. The Supreme Pack had grown terrified of the sudden, eerie silence from the beast. To appease their paranoia, Alexander was forced to bring me here for a traditional spiritual cleansing ritual. The elders claimed it was to test the purity of my bond with the king. I knew it was an inquisition, but I didn't care. I had been waiting for this exact moment. Standing at the edge of the clearing, surrounded by towering, centuries-old pines, was Elder Cornelius. He wore heavy ceremonial robes, his face a map of deep wrinkles, his eyes cold and calculating. In my past life, that raspy, aristocratic voice like dry leaves scraping across a tombstone had been the one to formally pronounce my death sentence. Today, I planned to let the beast rip his throat out on sacred ground. Alexander stood rigidly beside me, his hand tightly gripping mine. The tension radiating from him was palpable. Beneath the surface of his skin, I could feel the beast pacing, agitated by the heavy scent of incense and the hostile glares of the gathered elders. "Let the Omega step forward," Cornelius declared, the sound echoing through the misty trees. Alexander's grip tightened, his thumb stroking my knuckles in a frantic, grounding rhythm. "If anything feels wrong, Julian," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration in his chest. "I don't care about the laws. I will tear this place apart." I gave him a small, empty smile. "I'll be fine, Your Majesty." I released his hand and stepped into the center of the massive runic circle carved into the stone floor of the clearing. Cornelius began a chant in the old tongue. The air instantly grew heavy. The sweet, suffocating scent of burning sage and myrrh filled my lungs, mixing with the crackling hiss of magic sparking to life along the carved runes. My plan was simple: wait for the magic to peak, lower my mental shields, let the elders sense the beast's pure, unadulterated rage, and direct it straight at Cornelius. As the smoke swirled thickly around me, the chanting reached a fever pitch. A blinding, searing white light erupted from the runes, piercing straight through my chest. But it didn't trigger the beast. It triggered something else. Crack! It sounded like breaking glass inside my own skull. The forest vanished. The chanting faded into a distorted, underwater echo. A violent psychic snap tore through my consciousness, pulling me down into a vortex of sealed memories. Not my memories, his. The spiritual link of the ritual had bypassed my present mind and violently connected me to the deepest, most agonizing scar in Alexander's soul. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in the forest. I was lying on the cold stone of the Alpha King's private chambers. But I wasn't me. I was feeling what Alexander felt. My veins were on fire. The overwhelming, metallic tang of aconite, refined wolfsbane coated my throat, choking me. I was paralyzed, coughing up thick, black blood that splattered against the marble floor. The Omega is being dealt with, Your Majesty, a voice said from the shadows. Cornelius. His tone was dripping with smug satisfaction. A king cannot be tethered to a weak, defective servant. The poison will keep your beast sedated until the execution is complete. No, the thought wasn't mine, it was Alexander's. A scream of pure, helpless agony echoing in a paralyzed body. Through his eyes, I saw the spiritual manifestation of the beast inside his mind. It wasn't sedated. It was going insane. The creature was throwing its massive body against the silver-laced bars of its internal cage. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was horrifying. I felt the beast tearing its own claws out, shattering its own fangs against the silver, screaming my name, Julian, 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 in a desperate, blood-curdling roar of absolute despair. It was feeling my phantom ribs cracking in the dungeon below. It was feeling my life fading. And in its frantic, mindless desperation to break out and save me, the beast drove a silver spike through its own heart, dying so the king could be free to save me. But it was too late. The king was broken, I was dead. The psychic link severed with the force of a physical blow. I gasped, stumbling forward onto the cold stone of the sanctuary, my hands clawing at my chest. The thick smoke of the ritual was still swirling. Cornelius was still standing there, but his chanting had stopped. He was staring at me, his cold eyes widening in sudden realization. He could see it in my face. He could see that the ritual hadn't exposed a fake bond, it had awakened the truth of 2 lifetimes. My perfect, meticulously crafted hatred for Alexander shattered into 1,000,000 jagged pieces. He didn't abandon me. He had died with me. And the architect of our absolute destruction was standing 10 feet away. I slowly raised my head. The cold, calculated Omega was gone. What replaced him was a vessel of pure, ancient wrath. Yo, I whispered, the word vibrating with a demonic resonance that didn't sound human. Cornelius panicked. The Omega is corrupted. Execute him, he shrieked, raising his ceremonial staff. The runes beneath my feet flared violently, turning from white to a sickly, poisonous green. It was a kill array. Spikes of solid, crackling energy shot up from the ground, aimed directly at my heart. I didn't have time to move. I didn't have time to breathe. But Alexander did. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the mountain, a massive, blurred shadow crossed the clearing. Alexander didn't shift. He didn't use magic. He threw his own human body directly into the path of the kill array. The sickening, wet shock of energy-piercing flesh echoed through the silent forest. Time stopped. Alexander violently jerked, a choked gasp escaping his lips as the magical spikes impaled his torso. He fell to his knees, his blood instantly pooling on the ancient runes, his body acting as a perfect, impenetrable shield over mine. Alex, I screamed, a raw, devastating sound that tore my throat apart. I dropped to the stone, catching his heavy, bleeding body before he hit the ground. His breathing was wet and shallow. His molten gold eyes fluttered, looking up at me with the exact same desperate, agonizing vulnerability I had just seen in the past life. I've got you, he forced out, blood staining his teeth as he smiled weakly. I promised I wouldn't let them touch you. The beast inside him let out a silent, deafening shriek of sorrow. I pulled his head to my chest, my hands slick with his hot blood. The agonizing grief was overwhelming, but right behind it came a wave of fire so hot it threatened to burn the world to ash. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locking onto Cornelius, who was already taking a terrified step backward. I wasn't playing a game anymore. Today, I said, my voice dropping to terrifying, deadly calm that echoed through the trees. The blood debt of 2 lifetimes. I would collect in full. The ancient sanctuary of the Supreme Pack was descending into absolute chaos. But in the epicenter of the storm, my world had narrowed down to the fading, erratic rhythm of Alexander's heartbeat beneath my blood-soaked hands. Kill them. Kill them both before the array recharges. Cornelius's voice was a hysterical screech, stripped of all its aristocratic pretense. From the shadows of the towering pines, the Supreme Pack's elite guard emerged. Dozens of Lycans, heavily armed and fully shifted, their collective snarls creating a deafening, vibrating wall of sound. They were closing in. Alexander coughed a wet, rattling sound, his molten gold eyes fighting to stay focused on my face. His massive hand, trembling and cold, weakly gripped my bloody shirt. "Julian, run," he rasped, his lips stained a vibrant, terrifying red. "Shut up," I snarled a feral, desperate sound escaping my own throat. "You don't get to die for me again. Do you hear me? I refuse." In Lycan lore, the blood bond was an ancient, forbidden magic. It was considered a myth, a desperate ritual where a mate could tether a dying soul to their own by forging a bridge of pure, unfiltered life force. If the dying alpha wasn't strong enough, it would instantly kill the omega. I didn't care. I would gladly burn the remainder of my life to fuel his revenge. I raised my left wrist to my mouth and tore into my own flesh with my teeth. The pain was sharp and blinding, but the hot rush of crimson was immediate. "Julian!" No, Alexander choked out, recognizing what I was doing, trying to push me away with the last of his strength. "Take it," I ordered, pressing my bleeding wrist directly against his parted lips. I leaned down, my forehead resting against his, my voice dropping to a harsh, commanding vibration. "Take it, Alexander. Let the beast out. Let it all out." As my blood dripped past his teeth, the air in the clearing violently snapped. It wasn't a metaphor, there was a literal, deafening crack of displaced air, like thunder detonating at ground level. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated omega energy exploded from my core, saturated with the bitter, potent scent of defiance and absolute wrath. It hit Alexander like a lightning strike. I felt the exact moment his soul caught fire. His golden eyes snapped wide open, the pupils dilating until they swallowed the iris. The dying, erratic heartbeat beneath my hands didn't just stabilize, it erupted into a terrifying, thunderous war drum. Thud 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 thud. The magical spikes impaling him dissolved into hissing black smoke. The Supreme Pack guards, who had been charging toward us, slammed on the brakes, their wolves whining as an invisible, crushing pressure dropped over the clearing. The alpha aura radiating from Alexander was no longer human. But it wasn't just the beast either. It was a perfect, terrifying amalgamation of both. He rose. He didn't just stand up, he unfolded from the bloody stone like a dark god of war awakening from a centuries-long slumber. He was still in his human form, but he was larger, his muscles tearing through the remains of his shredded shirt. His nails had elongated into wicked, obsidian claws. His jaw was locked, his canines elongated, and his eyes were the blazing, merciless gold of a predator that had finally been let off its leash. The beast wasn't chained in the dark anymore. The king and the monster had become one. "Protect the elder," a guard yelled, raising a silver-loaded rifle. Alexander didn't roar. He simply moved. He was a blur of midnight and violence. The sound of his impact was sickening, the wet, heavy crunch of a ribcage collapsing under a single, devastating punch. The guard flew backward, lifeless before he hit the ancient stone. "Fire! Fire at will!" Cornelius shrieked, backing away frantically. Gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks echoing through the trees. But Alexander was a phantom. He moved with the lethal, fluid grace of the beast, effortlessly dodging the silver rounds. I didn't run. I didn't take cover. I stood exactly where he had left me, in the dead center of the runic circle, my bloody hands resting at my sides. I was completely, utterly safe. Every time a guard tried to flank me, Alexander was there. Rip, snap, howl. The massacre was a symphony of destruction. I watched him tear through the elite guards like they were made of wet paper. He ripped throats out with his bare hands. He shattered spines with the casual flick of his wrist. He was painting the sacred, pristine stone of the sanctuary with the blood of the corrupt. And through the carnage, our psychic link hummed. I wasn't just watching him kill, I was guiding him. A guard tried to sneak up from the blind spot behind the altar. I didn't even turn my head. I just projected a single, cold thought left. Alexander pivoted midair, backhanding the guard with enough force to snap his neck with a sharp, resonant crack. We were a perfect, lethal machine. I was the architect, he was the executioner. Within 3 minutes, the clearing was dead silent, save for the wet drip of blood raining from the ancient pine needles and the frantic, wheezing gasps of the last man standing. Cornelius. The elder was backed up against the massive stone altar, his heavy ceremonial robes stained with the mud and blood of his fallen guards. His face was a mask of sheer, paralyzing terror. He raised his glowing runic staff, his hands shaking violently. You are an abomination, Cornelius spat, though his voice cracked. The Supreme Pack will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Alexander walked toward him slowly, the heavy, rhythmic thump of his boots echoed my beast's phantom paws. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and caught the heavy, magical staff in one massive, clawed hand. The enchantments on the wood hissed, trying to burn his skin. Alexander didn't flinch. He tightened his grip. Crack, splinter. The ancient artifact shattered into 1,000 useless pieces, the magical core dying with a pathetic whine. Cornelius let out a breathless, terrified sob, falling to his knees. Mercy. He whispered, "Mercy, Your Majesty." Alexander looked down at him, his face an impassive mask of cold, predatory indifference. Then, he looked across the clearing, straight at me. He was asking for permission. He was offering me the kill. I looked at the wrinkled, pathetic old man who had ordered my execution in a dark dungeon 5 years ago. My chest felt incredibly light. The crushing weight of the past life finally lifted, burning away into ash. I gave Alexander a slow single nod. With a sickening wet tear, Alexander drove his claws straight through Cornelius's chest, ripping the elder's heart out in a single, brutal motion. The old man slumped forward, dead before he hit the stone. It was over. The magical backlash of the elder's death caused the surrounding torches to flare violently, catching the dry pine needles. A ring of fire slowly began to enclose the clearing, casting dancing, orange shadows over the slaughter. Alexander dropped the bloody organ and slowly turned toward me. The feral, predatory aura was still rolling off him in suffocating waves. He crossed the clearing, his golden eyes locked onto mine, tracking my every breath. When he reached me, he didn't gently pull me into a hug like the broken man in the archives. He grabbed my waist with his bloody hands, lifting me completely off the ground and crushing me against his chest. He buried his face in my neck, inhaling my scent with deep, shuddering breaths, his fangs scraping lightly against my pulse point. The way he held me, it wasn't just love. It was an absolute, terrifying declaration of ownership. The beast and the king had merged, and their combined, obsessive devotion was entirely, suffocatingly focused on me. Mine, he growled against my skin, the sound vibrating straight into my bones. You are mine, Julian. In this life, and the next, I will burn the rest of the world before I let you go again. I wrapped my arms around his broad, blood-slick shoulders, resting my head against his. As the fire roared around us, consuming the sanctuary and the ashes of our past, I closed my eyes and smiled. I know, I whispered into his ear. Take us home, Alpha. We didn't just return to Manhattan, we descended upon it like a biblical plague. The ashes of the sanctuary were still smoldering in the Adirondacks, but the real fire had been brought straight to the heart of the lycanthrope tower. With Cornelius dead and the Supreme Pack's elite guard decimated, the delicate, corrupt ecosystem of the eastern seaboard's high society completely collapsed. For the first time in 5 generations, an Alpha King had achieved perfect, terrifying synthesis with his beast. Alexander didn't need to issue threats. The moment the private elevator doors opened to the penthouse level, the sheer, suffocating weight of his combined aura brought every guard servant and pack official to their knees. The air pressure in the building permanently shifted, heavy with the sharp scent of ozone blood, in absolute dominance. The purge was swift, silent, and flawlessly brutal. I didn't have to lift a finger. I simply sat in the glass-walled conservatory, sipping black tea, while Alexander meticulously dismantled the opposition. The board members who had orchestrated my past execution were dragged from their beds in the dead of night. There were no trials. There were no negotiations. By dawn, the Sterling Pack had been cleansed. And then, there was Evelyn Blackwood. They brought her to the grand foyer of the penthouse, her designer silk robes torn, her flawless makeup ruined by streaks of mascara and absolute, shivering terror. The arrogant, untouchable White Lotus who had once condemned me to the dark was currently sobbing uncontrollably on the Italian marble floor. I walked out to meet her, the soft swish of my clothes the only sound in the dead silent room. Alexander stood perfectly still behind my right shoulder, a towering monolith of dark, lethal energy. His eyes never left me. Julian, please, Evelyn begged, her voice a shrill, scraping sound. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know the king was. Hello. Vibrating snarl echoed through the room. It didn't come from the shadows, it came directly from Alexander's chest. Evelyn physically recoiled, curling into a pathetic ball. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The burning hatred was gone, replaced by the cold, sterile indifference you feel when looking at an insect. Strip the Blackwood family of all pack affiliations, I said quietly, not looking back at Alexander. Seize their assets. Banish them to the Northern Territories. If they cross the border back into New York, kill them. No, you can't, she shrieked, struggling as two massive guards hauled her up by her arms. You're just a servant. You're just a... Her shrieks faded as the heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing her fate. The transition of power was absolute. I was no longer the Beast Keeper. My name was etched into the ancient pack registry in glowing golden runic script directly beside Alexander's. I was the Luna. I held half the empire in my hands. But with absolute victory came a terrifying realization. I had saved Alexander, but the man he used to be was gone. The fusion was permanent. The beast wasn't a separate entity living in his subconscious anymore. It was looking through his eyes 24 hours a day. And its obsessive, predatory devotion was now perfectly merged with the king's intellect. The result was suffocating. He refused to be more than 3 feet away from me. If a servant looked at me for a second too long, Alexander's eyes would flash molten gold and a low, warning rumble would vibrate the floorboards. His touch was constant, a hand resting heavily on the nape of my neck, his fingers tracing my spine, his nose constantly buried in my hair to inhale my scent. It was a terrifying, beautiful, consuming darkness. 1 week later, the Sterling Pack held a mandatory press conference in the Grand Ballroom to formally announce the new hierarchy to the Lycan world. The room was packed with hundreds of reporters, foreign dignitaries, and terrified, subservient nobles. The click-click flash of cameras created a blinding, chaotic storm of light. I stood at the podium, dressed in an immaculate, dark-tailored suit, while Alexander stood slightly behind me, a silent, imposing shadow. The era of the Supreme Pack's interference is over, I announced, my voice amplified by the microphones, cutting smoothly through the tension. The Sterling Pack answers to no one but the crown. A question for the new Luna, an abrasive, loud voice cut through the crowd. A reporter from a rival Southern pack pushed his way to the front, stepping directly over the velvet security rope. He was a massive, scarred alpha, and he was deliberately leaking aggressive, challenging pheromones into the air, a subtle, calculated disrespect meant to test my composure. How does an orphaned Omega, a former flesh scrubber, justify sitting on the highest throne in the country? Have you used dark magic too? He didn't finish the sentence. The temperature in the ballroom plummeted to freezing. The crack of the marble floor splintering under Alexander's boots echoed like a gunshot. Alexander didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift. He simply stepped in front of me, his eyes flaring a blinding, demonic gold. He unleashed his aura, a concussive, physical wave of pure, unadulterated Alpha King dominance. It hit the massive reporter like a physical blow. The sound of it was sickening, the heavy, immediate thud of the reporter's knees violently hitting the floor as his body was forcibly crushed by the invisible pressure. He gasped, his hands clawing at his own throat as he struggled to breathe, tears of sheer, primal terror streaming down his face. Total, paralyzed silence fell over the ballroom. Nobody dared to breathe. Nobody dared to move. The press conference is over, Alexander stated, his voice a lethal, rumbling vibration that shook the crystal chandeliers. He wrapped a massive arm around my waist, lifting me slightly as he pulled me off the stage and through the private side doors. The moment the heavy, soundproof oak doors clicked shut behind us, isolating us in his private anteroom, the atmosphere violently shifted. Alexander shoved me back against the door. His hands were everywhere, gripping my waist, tangling in my hair. He buried his face in the crook of my neck, inhaling my scent in deep, frantic, shuddering gasps. His fangs scraped roughly against my pulse point, right over the mating mark he had left. Alex, I breathed, my hands resting on his broad, tense shoulders. Mind, he growled against my skin, the sound dark, rough, and dripping with an obsession that defied logic. He pressed his massive body completely against mine, trapping me against the wood. They don't get to look at you. They don't get to breathe your air. You're mine, Julian, only mine. I tilted my head back, exposing my throat to him entirely, a slow, dark smile spreading across my lips. I know, I whispered, pulling his head up to capture his lips in a bruising, desperate kiss. The world below the lycanthrope tower belonged to us. The eastern seaboard's underground economy, the political machinations of the Lycan elite, The lives of millions, all of it was controlled from the sprawling, glass-walled labyrinth of our penthouse. But I rarely saw the outside world anymore. I had traded a damp, blood-soaked dungeon for a cage of reinforced glass and pure, unadulterated gold. In the weeks following the purge, Alexander's paranoia and possessiveness hadn't subsided. They had mutated into a beautiful, terrifying obsession. The Alpha King had completely integrated with the beast, and the resulting creature recognized only one god, me. The penthouse was purged of almost all staff. Alexander couldn't tolerate the scent of other wolves, especially alphas or unbonded omegas lingering in the same airspace as me. The few servants permitted to deliver our meals were strictly instructed to keep their eyes locked on the floor. If a gaze accidentally drifted to my face or worse, my throat where Alexander's mating mark sat as a dark, permanent brand, the air pressure in the room would instantly drop. Alexander wouldn't yell. He would simply emit a low, vibrating growl from deep within his chest, a sound so primal and lethal it sent grown men dropping to their knees in sheer terror. He was suffocating. He was a dark, heavy blanket of feral devotion, and he refused to let me breathe without him. I was currently sitting in his sprawling private office, the heart of the Sterling Empire. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, a heavy Manhattan thunderstorm raged, lightning flashing against the dark sky. Inside the soft, mournful strains of a cello concerto played through the vintage sound system, a stark contrast to the heavy, wet sound of Alexander's breathing. I was lounging lazily sideways on his massive leather chair, my legs draped over the armrest. Clink, ring. The delicate sound cut through the cello music. I shifted my foot, listening to it again. Encircling my left ankle was a custom-made, intricate chain of solid white gold, adorned with a single, tiny silver bell. It wasn't attached to a wall. It didn't physically restrict my movement. But it was a collar, a marker, a brilliant, shining declaration to the entire world that I was a kept thing. In my past life, if someone had put a chain on me, I would have broken down in tears of absolute terror. Now, I traced the cool metal with my toe and smiled a slow, dark, languid smile. Because the man who had placed it there was currently kneeling on the floor beside the chair, resting his massive head against my thigh. Alexander was in his human form, wearing dress slacks and a tailored silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar. But the beast was completely present in his eyes, two blazing, slit-pupiled spheres of molten gold glowing in the dim light of the office. He was gently, obsessively stroking the skin of my calf, his elongated, obsidian claws lightly dragging over my skin without breaking it, a dangerous, intoxicating caress. "You're thinking about the past," he murmured, his voice a deep, rough vibration that sent a shiver straight up my spine. He didn't ask, he stated it as a fact. The bond between us was so absolute he could taste the shift in my pheromones. "I was thinking," I corrected softly, running my fingers through his thick, silver blonde hair, massaging the scalp at the base of his neck, exactly the way the beast liked it, "about how far we've come. From a dirty, freezing cell to this." Alexander let out a ragged breath. The mere mention of the dungeon, of the place where I had died in our previous life, always triggered a violent wave of protective instinct in him. His hands gripped my waist, pulling me closer until I was half sliding off the chair, my chest pressed against his face. He buried his nose into my neck, inhaling my scent in deep, desperate gasps. "Never again," he growled wetly against my skin, his fangs scraping the sensitive flesh of my collarbone. "I will burn the earth to cinders. I will tear the stars down. They will never touch you. You are safe. You are mine." It was a sick, twisted, beautiful kind of love. It wasn't the pure, innocent romance of fairy tales. It was forged in blood, betrayal, and the ashes of our enemies. It was a love that bordered on madness. But as his heavy, muscular arms wrapped around me, locking me in an inescapable embrace, I closed my eyes and let out a soft, contented sigh. I had been abandoned. I had been murdered. I had been terrified of the dark, but here, in the suffocating grip of an alpha king who loved me to the point of insanity, I found the one thing I had been searching for across 2 lifetimes: absolute, impenetrable safety. I was his weakness, but he was my invincible shield. I tilted my head, looking down at him. Alexander slowly lifted his face. His golden eyes locked onto mine, feral and completely stripped of his human mask. He brought my left hand to his lips. He didn't kiss my knuckles. The beast within him emerged, extending a rough, hot tongue to slowly, reverently lick the heavy diamond and platinum wedding band on my ring finger. He rubbed his cheek against my palm, a low, rumbling purr vibrating in his throat. He was a weapon of mass destruction, a nightmare that made the entire world tremble, but here in the dark, chained by his own obsessive devotion, he was completely, utterly tamed. And he was tamed only by me. Clink ring. I shifted my leg, letting the tiny golden bell chime in the dark. Wrapping my arms around my monster, my king, my perfect. Lethal cage.